while I didn't think I was going to go to Hollywood, I did have this brief fascination with music videos. I've always really loved music, in particular indie rock. And I wrote, after I finished that semester at NYU Film, I actually wrote letters, because that was a thing that we did back then, to many of my favorite bands and asked if I could make their music video. And one of the bands got back to me, a band called Jawbox. And they were big stalwarts of the DC punk rock, indie rock scene. And they ended up opening up for Nirvana on a tour at one point. And I loved their record, the one record I'd heard at the time. And they said, yeah, you can make our music video. So I for like $150, I made their a music video. You actually see it on YouTube. That is on YouTube. It looks like it was made for $150. I remember seeing on MTV back in the day, they would listed the title of the song, the name of the song, and the band. They would also list the director. So there was a guy named Kevin Kerslake who had made at least one Nirvana video, and then I think some Smashing Pumpkins videos. And I tracked him down and sent him this video. And I was still a junior in college, and he wrote me back and said, yeah, if you want to come to LA, you can work for me. And my parents lost their minds and said no. And so I didn't do that. And I ended up going into TV news.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Jake Dunlap Show. We are very excited that you joined us. If you haven't tuned in, this is the show where we talk to celebrities, thought, and industry leaders to really discover their journey to success. I am super excited that you're joining us. This show is like no other. I can promise you that. You might laugh, you might cry, but you will definitely leave inspired and gain a whole new level of insight into those people that you follow, love, and admire. All right. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Jake Dunlap Show. I am, of course, Jake Dunlap. With me today, I have a very special guest, author, somebody that you might see on TV every week, who you welcome into your household, someone who I think has had an impact on many of us, both professionally and personally. And I'm very excited to welcome Mr. Dan Harris to the show. Thank you, Dan, for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited for this conversation. So we talked about this a little bit in the pregame. You know, with each episode, what we'll do is really talk through what's made Dan, and how you've arrived to where you're at today, and the different journey along the way. So, like with everybody else, I like to start back with the old days. So, born in Newton, Mass, right?
Actually, born in Washington, D.C., but we moved up to Newton, Mass. Sometime before I turned 2, I believe.
Okay. All right. So born in DC, but then you go to Newton, Mass. You have a father who's a chair at Harvard University's Radiation and Oncology and Residency program. You have a mother who's a very successful pathologist as well. So what was life like growing up in that type of household? You know, obviously I've read some excerpts from the book where, you talk about the family a little bit, but what was that experience like for you?
Positive. My dad used to say I remember my dad saying to us when we were kids, so they come in and, kiss us goodnight. And I think he had this thing he would say, nobody's perfect, but you're as close as they get, or something along those. That was one of his little things that he said. Aww. And I feel like that is true of my parents. It's impossible to be a perfect parent, but they were really close. They were very, very good parents. I think they modeled a lot of the things that are important to me now. Having, being really serious about your career, but also choosing a career that's impactful and that helps other people. Being really serious about their marriage to one another and their relationship, and also taking care of yourself. They were among the first runners. Running wasn't a thing that was done very commonly back in the 70s. And my parents really embraced that early on. My dad started running the Boston Marathon, which went right by our house, about a couple blocks away from our house. And I remember my little brother, Matt, and I standing out on Com Ave and handing out when he would run by, we would hand him a little thing of water. So yeah, they were great parents. My mother is still is, obviously. They're both still alive, although they both have had some health problems. But my mother is just so incredibly smart, and she was. I think they would both agree, the smarter parent. And in many ways, the more, in the end, probably the more renowned physician. My dad was the chair of radiation oncology at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, but my mom became an editor at the New England Journal of Medicine and edited a really popular part of that prestigious medical journal, and just so smart. And I think I'm really glad to have been raised by a very tough and smart woman. That is a big deal for me.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, it's an interesting take. I think some people in those scenarios, it can be almost intimidating, right? But it sounds like this is a scenario where you thrived and felt like you had the support throughout. And so then you're growing up, you have these parents who are supportive. They're telling you, you're the closest thing to perfection. That's a great line as well too. I really like that. And then you're going to high school. You stay in Newton, so you're going to Newton South High School, the Lions, if I'm correct.
Yes.
Where you played drums.
Uh-huh.
Is that correct? You played drums?
I did play drums, yes. Not well, but I did play the drums.
All right. Is there a YouTube video of this somewhere? Do you know if this exists? I looked on, I could not find one.
No, I don't. One of the kids in the band, we had a band. The Moving Finger was named after an Agatha Christie novel that was on the wall in our basement. That was like on the bookshelf in our basement at our family home. My mother liked mystery novels a lot, and still does, actually. And so I don't know. We thought that was a funny name for a book, and that's what we named the band. And one of the kids in the band, Brian Sheff, I remember him taking a lot of videos, like one of those big camcorders, because this would have been back in 1987, 88, 89.
Oh, yeah.
And must have had a VHS tape shoved
huge
in it.
VHS.
Yeah.
I remember those.
But I've never seen them, so I would love to see them. We were bad. We were really a bad band.
We've got to find them.
It was fun.
We've got to find them. I saw you did play with somebody who did have a band, though, like Unbanded, maybe. Like you played with somebody who did have some mediocre fame.
Yeah. One of the guys, one of the bass player in the Moving Finger went on to be a musician of some renown, Mike Ruffino. He was in a band called the Unband. I've never really listened to. I think they were like pretty hardcore.
I did listen. Yes, it's hardcore.
Yeah, I think Mike wrote a book about his experience in the band, which I haven't read, but apparently it was a pretty wild time.
I bet. And so, what was that like for you? So you're growing up in high school. Obviously, this is a large high school. So, what was high school like for you? So you have these successful parents. Things are, obviously seems like very strong at home. Feel supported. So, what was high school like for you?
It was actually pretty tumultuous. So pretty tumultuous, but pretty tumultuous for like an unbelievably privileged kid.
Right.
So you said, before that it could be intimidating to live with parents who are that impressive. And I think on some level it might have been. My younger brother, who I mentioned before, Matt, was incredibly, just really, really smart. And so were my parents. And I actually, in the family, was and probably still am the least intelligent, like I would score the lowest on a standardized test, let's say. And I did struggle with standardized tests. Not that I was, failing them, but I wasn't doing, like my brother would get, like these stratospheric numbers, and mine were more sort of middling. And I also I fell in with a kind of group of not the most studious kids. My parents referred to my friends as the Brain Trust. Okay. And so they were pretty raucous group of boys. And so for the first couple of years in high school, I fought a lot with my parents and did not do well in school. And at some point, actually, my parents did a really smart thing. I don't know if this was their idea or somebody else's idea. They drew up contracts, maybe in our sophomore or junior year in high school. And the contracts, they were called the Harris Accords. Okay. And they were called that because if we did well in school, I don't know. They included my brother in the contract, even though he didn't really.
Yeah, he's doing fine, but he gets looped in because of the older brother.
Yes, because of his older brother. Anyway, if we did well enough, we would get a used Honda Accord as our car. And if we got a certain GPA, we would get a certain allowance, et cetera, et cetera. They said they really incentivized us to do well in school, and that plus waking up to the fact that, having done very poorly in my freshman and part of my sophomore year, I was jeopardizing my ability to be successful as a grown-up. I started to study, maybe sophomore, junior year, but I was really coming from behind the eight ball because my freshman year was a disaster. C's and D's, I think.
And what made you, I mean, like, again, obviously that's a part of it, was there, I guess, like a moment where you realize, because I think even as a sophomore, junior, to realize like, hey, there's a future ahead of me. Usually the future is, Friday and, beers and tailgates, right? What do you think it was that, I mean, maybe your parents did have the foresight to know that this is what it would do, but what do you think it was in you that you kind of had that realization very early of like, hey, like, I do want to have a career. This is important to me and I need to get my act together.
I'd always wanted to be successful. I mean, and I'm not saying this like it's a good thing. I think there were a couple factors. One was my parents, while they were successful in academic medicine, which was not super remunerative. So, I mean, we had a very comfortable life. But one of the things I've learned about happiness is that the human species, it's just, one of the big factors in our personal happiness is how are we doing compared to the people around us. And so we lived in this town, Newton, Massachusetts, which is a very interesting place because it has everything from housing projects, and it's a city, so it has many housing projects, but it also, like, that's where Sumner Redstone lives. So you have really, really, really rich people, and then also working class, middle class, upper middle class, working class, and then low income. And so I had friends who lived in the housing projects, really good friends, but I also had these incredibly wealthy friends. And my parents, in comparison to the super wealthy friends, didn't make that much money. We had a relatively small house, and especially early on, before they got Honda Accords, they drove like crappy cars, and
there's like
that
a
was
Datsun.
embarrassing.
There had to have been like a
me,
Datsun at some point.
What's that?
I said a Datsun at some point.
Yeah, it was like a shit brown Plymouth Valiant, and like a gray Chevy Chevette hatchback. I remember them both. And I remember this one point, my parents took us to Europe on vacation, which is going to sound fancier than it was. They didn't have to pay for anything because they were being funded by academic institutions in Europe to go over there and give speeches about the latest research they were doing in medicine. And we went and traveled around Europe. And at one point, when we got to Paris, the whatever academic institution was hosting them there put us up in a really fancy hotel, the Hotel Regina. Still remember it. Maybe it's a shithole and like, but my memory.
But you're in high school. That like everything is amazing. You're in Paris.
Exactly. But I remember it being gilded, and I remember I must have been 10, telling myself I am not going to live like my parents do. I'm not. They wore like down parkas in the winter because they didn't want to jack the heat up. This Hotel Regina thing was the way I was going to live.
Yeah.
And so I lost sight of that when I was in junior high and high school because I got swept up in trying to be cool.
Yeah.
And academic performance was not an important metric in coolness in my group of friends. Right. And so I got in a lot of trouble. And then ultimately I think woke up to my Hotel Regina dreams.
That's right.
Back in the middle of high school.
Yeah, you'd have flashbacks to the gilded rooms. We'll have to look that up. I'll put a link in the show notes so we can take a look at what it's like. So then you choose to go to Colby College. What was that decision process like? Is that where you knew you wanted to go? I mean, in Waterville, Maine, right?
No.
So what was that like? What made you make that decision? And you did a lot of different work there. Between, I think you did some internships in DC and in Paris and some details in NYU. But why Colby? What made you pick Colby College?
I didn't have a ton of options because I didn't perform super well in high school. I mean, I think my grades in the latter years were pretty good. And
sure.
I got okay SATs, but it's not like Harvard was an option. I mean, Colby is a great school, was a great school, and is even better school now. I mean, it's very hard to get. I would not get in now. So it's a really great school. But it's, again, it wasn't like I was dying to go to Colby.
Yeah.
In particular, my dad
it wasn't
knew the dean.
I was in Yale, I was in these other ones, and I'm choosing Colby.
Exactly.
Yeah.
My dad knew the dean, and that helped, if I'm being honest. And I had the grades to get in, and so it wasn't like a complete boondoggle, but it really did help. And the dean was really nice when I showed up to take a tour of the campus, and I really liked him. And so the rest is history. As it turned out, I think Colby is a fantastic institution. It might not have been the exact right one for me, and I didn't really love being in the country. And so I ended up spending 3 semesters away. As you referenced, I went off and went to Washington, D.C. to work in the news business. I went to Paris, where I worked in TV. And then I went to NYU to study film. So I was kind of interested in lots of other stuff, and then came back and finished off my senior year at Colby.
And what were those years like for you? And also, at what point did you realize that TV, you realized that you wanted to make something of yourself, but at what point did you realize, whether it was TV or film, that this is the way that you wanted to do it?
Actually, so I talked about not doing well in school in high school. I actually did really well in school at Colby, but that was largely because I didn't have to take math. I didn't have to. I could pick my own courses.
I hear you.
So I took a lot of literature classes, and I think I minored in French literature, and then took political science stuff. And I was reasonably good at writing papers, and I liked reading books and having discussions, and so that was all really fun. But I knew I wanted to be successful, but finance wasn't going to be where it was going to happen for me. And I had this vague notion. I was interested in either the movies, like being a film director, or television news. But I had them kind of conflated in my mind. I thought they were both very glamorous. I ended up doing a bunch of internships in TV news and realizing that it's not very glamorous, but it is really cool,
right,
and fun and interesting. And then I went to film school and realized that actually is quite glamorous, but that I had no aptitude for it. So I ended up just getting a job out of college in TV news, and that was kind of the rest is history.
Yeah, it's interesting. I spent the first part of my career in professional sports and Major League Baseball and the business side and the NHL, and it's a similar cachet. It's, oh wow, you're working in sports. It's like, well, it's not in the early days again. And like, I'm excited to dive into the days at Bangor and Portland. I think that there's a perception, and that, when you put in the work, it takes a while, but it's maybe not as glamorous out of the gate as a lot of people might think. So you get into this, you realize you're like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. Or potentially this is what I'm going to do. Was this the only choice that you had? Meaning, were you all in on being an anchor at a news station? Was that kind of the path for you? You knew that's what you wanted to try, or were you still thinking about other options and this was the one that said, sure, Dan?
I don't, I did have this brief fascination in college with, while I didn't think I was going to go to Hollywood, I did have this brief fascination with music videos. I've always really loved music, in particular indie rock. And I wrote, after I finished that semester at NYU Film, I actually wrote letters, because that was a thing that we did back then, to many of my favorite bands, and asked if I could make their music video. And one of the bands got back to me, a band called Jawbox. And they were big stalwarts of the DC punk rock, indie rock scene. And they ended up opening up for Nirvana on a tour at one point. And I loved their record, the one record I'd heard at the time. And they said, yeah, you can make our music video. So I for like $150, I made their music video. You actually see it on YouTube. That is on YouTube.
And what was the song? What was the song?
cut off.
I love it.
It looks like it was made for $150. This is back in like 1992. Anyway, I ended up sending that to. I love Nirvana. I still love Nirvana, and I remember seeing on MTV back in the day they would list when they listed the title of the song, the name of the song, and the band. They would also list the director. So there was a guy named Kevin Kerslake who had made at least one Nirvana video, and then I think some Smashing Pumpkins videos. And I tracked him down and sent him this video. And I was still a junior in college, and he wrote me back and said, yeah, if you want to come to LA, you can work for me. And my parents lost their minds and said no. And so I didn't do that and ended up going to, I don't know why, I don't know how that fell by the wayside and why I didn't go back to that when I graduated. But when I graduated, I ended up going into TV news. And I was pretty sure after having done it for a while that I loved it, but I still had in the back of my head, I was intoxicated by the fact that I had done really well at Colby. It was the first time I had really succeeded at anything. I think I graduated, I really toward the top of my class at Colby, which was a huge deal for me because I truly had I'd never been really good at sports. I'd never succeeded academically in any big way. And so I think I graduated like summa cum laude at Colby, and I was a huge deal for me. And I kind of wanted to see if I could continue with that. And so I actually applied to go to MBA programs a couple of years after being in the news business. Even though I loved the news, I just kind of was interested in seeing if I could get a degree. I wanted to get what my parents had and what my brother had, which is like big deal academic honors, and got totally rejected. And in large measure because my standardized tests weren't that good.
Yeah.
But other than that, I did love TV news and really haven't looked back.
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, it could have just been a whole new path for you. You know, you could have, that's really interesting to think that the role of a video producer, there's got to be part of you that looked back and it's like, man, what would have happened? What would the summer in LA understudying with Nirvana? That's a pretty amazing experience, opportunity.
I think it would have been bad for me.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I was pretty impressionable.
I think you picked right.
I think it's also good that I didn't get into business school. I think the right things happened every step of the way.
Well, that's right. Yeah, it would have been like, what was the group? The Brain Trust 2.0?
Yes.
Is that
yes.
Yeah, it would have been the Brain Trust 2.0 maybe. So you get a role in Bangor, Maine, right? And from what I understand about kind of the news and journalism world is you got to kind of go pay your dues. You go to these different locations, you know, early on, and then you kind of move up. So your first few roles, you're in Bangor, you're in Portland. What were those first years out like for you? You know, working, you're out, you've had success now in college, you're becoming focused on this. What were those first formative years from Bangor, Portland, Nesson, you know, as you're thinking about those first, you know, call it 7 years out, what were those years like for you?
I mean, they were great. I have happy memories of that time in Bangor, Portland, and then Boston at a little station called New England Cable News, or NECN. Just really cutting my teeth. And it was cool to be, for me at least, to less so in Boston because that's such a big news market and I was at a small station, but right. In Bangor and Portland, you know, it was somewhat well known.
Yeah, you're like, you're Dan Harris.
Yes.
Like, oh, there's Dan.
Yes, that was I liked that. And I don't say that with, it's a little embarrassing how much I liked it. But I did like it. And I loved the news. I mean, I loved being a journalist. I liked, as I think I wrote this somewhere, that you had license to walk up to important people and ask them impertinent questions. And I like telling stories, and I like dreaming up stories and then going and producing them. I liked being on the air. I liked the art of live news anchoring was very intriguing to me. It's a very difficult thing to do. And just learning that in a small place where you could make some mistakes was great. I suspect memory sugarcoats a little bit, and that in real time I was way more stressed.
Right.
and didn't really know how to handle that stress and could be pretty obnoxious at times. That is actually, I shouldn't say I suspect. I should say I know that was the case. And so I don't want to pretend that it was all unicorns and rainbows, but it was really formative for me. And I do look back at it fondly.
Yeah. Are there specific from that early period? Because I think as people get into this, they kind of take different trajectories where they kind of go into, they stay here, and then you make the move to obviously ABC News in 2000. What was it that started to drive you to continue to move up? I think, again, as people even in Bangor or Portland, they could say, hey, this is going to be great. You're Dan, again, you're walking down in Bangor. Oh, hey, Dan, right? Everyone's excited, but you kind of continue to try to find new opportunities. And so what was it that kind of drove you to continue to push toward that and then eventually, land the role with ABC News?
The Hotel Regina.
The Hotel Regina.
Yeah, I think
constant.
This nameless drive that a lot of us have, like filling some hole, some sense of insufficiency. And that can be true. I mean, it's amazing that you can have nearly perfect parents and that can still be true for you,
Sure. Is that still something you reference? Is that still something that you think about?
For sure.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's still something. I think looking at it and having a real relationship with what is that part of the mind that is voracious. It's uncomfortable to look at it, but I think that it's good to look at it because seeing it will allow you to have a wiser relationship to it. So yes, there is a part of my personality that is incredibly ambitious. And so you can do the work in therapy to figure out what's that all about, or you can just have a more meditative stance, which is, I see that part of me coming up, but do I need to act on all of those impulses, or can I just act on only the best version of those impulses? And that has been very useful for me. And it's not like I'm perfect. I still make dumb decisions, or, I still work too hard. I think that's inarguable. But I try to make better decisions and not be guided just by this kind of blind ambition.
Yeah, I think that when I talk to different leaders, it's common. There's usually a thing. Whether it's I talked to a CEO of a big tech company, and for him, he went to Harvard, but he was the smartest kid in his high school, and there was I think like a math 1 class, and he got just destroyed. And so for him, it was kind of the opposite. It was like, I'm now here. Here's my new vision of what, kind of greatness looks like. And I think from talking to different leaders, that's a theme that I've noticed with highly successful people, is that there's an anchor, an event, whether it's the Hotel Regina or a different version of it. And so I think it resonates. And so when you get to ABC News, what's that like for you? Is that where you're sitting, you're like, wow, like this is like, I'm here. What are the first few years, like for you there? Because I know you covered a lot of stories early, obviously 9/11. I know there's a lot of other stories that you covered, early on in ABC News. And so what were those first, call it 3 or 4 formative years like for you?
You said at one point, you asked, what was that like? Wow, I'm here. I read that to mean maybe like, did I feel like, okay, I've arrived?
Yeah.
That is not how I felt. I mean, I felt like I was in the big leagues, but I didn't feel like, okay, now I can relax. I got here. I felt as if I needed to work 75 times harder. And I had, I had been reasonably big fish in reasonably small ponds, and now I was the plankton in a huge sea of fame and high stakes and viewership, and working with people like Peter Jennings and Barbara Walters and Diane Sawyer, and just really big names directly with them. and a huge organization, more than 1,000 people work for ABC News around the planet. And it's, and there were all these correspondents competing to get on the air. It was a very tough environment. And so the stress level went through the roof.
Yeah, but it sounds like that you thrive for that, or potentially though, or at least that ability to perform under pressure, or to put yourself in that situation to then have those opportunities. That then when opportunities arose, you were there to take it. When you did get those breaks.
I don't know that I did. I survived, but it's not like it's not. If I whittle it down to like, what do I want to be doing? Being in a scramble to get a story or to get the next job does not bring out the best in me. That is not what I want to be doing. What I want to be doing is, what makes me happy is finding and telling great stories, having great relationships with the people that I'm working with, coming up with amazing ideas and trying them out. Increasingly over time, what's become interesting to me is mentoring, which wasn't a big focus for me when I was younger. So that period of time, I think, was good. I'm glad I had that experience, but I wouldn't want to go back to it.
Yeah.
And I'm not looking for that kind of pressure now.
Well, I think that there's that part in people's career that sometimes later they like you talked about mentoring, for example. And as you mentor, you talk through those times. That I'll just, kind of my own experience, kind of growing up in the sales and sales leadership, very, high stress, situations where, every month, every quarter, every year, the bar never ends, right? The bar is never like, it's never lower. I think you kind of look back over those years with, I can relate to that, where you look back and say, wow, like, I don't want to do that again. I'm grateful for the experience. But I think sometimes I don't know if it's an unfortunate rite of passage, maybe, but not necessarily that it has to be. And I don't know how that lands with you, or if you feel like those types of elements were critical to your later success, or if there was maybe a smarter way in retrospect.
I think it's both. And, my wife, my wife is a very successful physician, and went through really intense residency and fellowship training after med school. And it was brutal. I mean, I was living with her for that period of time, and it was hard. It was really tough. And they've since changed the rules about how long you're allowed to work. But I think she looks as unhappy in some ways as those years were. I think she looked back at the ferocity of the challenge and the intensity of the training as a good thing for her. And I think it's roughly true in my case. The one thing that I have spent some time undoing, at least one thing, is it was not a very nice environment. And
right.
I picked up some bad habits that I've had to unlearn around, kind of a hierarchical view where the junior employees aren't given that much respect, where the 800-pound gorilla in the room, throws his or her weight around, and there's this concept that I've only recently learned about in the last couple of years called psychological safety. It's a term of art.
Yeah.
It basically means just on a team, how safe does everybody feel to speak up? That psychological safety was not engendered in any systematic or successful way in the ABC News of yore. It's actually changed. It's a much better place now in numerous ways. But I took that hierarchical authoritarian style. I didn't know I was doing it, but I did take it into my later work, and to the detriment of my relationships and to the functioning of the teams I was on. So I'm glad I went through what I went through. I wish I hadn't picked up so many bad habits.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's easy to look back at it and again, I think view it, but I think it's also, it can be very difficult if that's how you're you're raised or groomed almost at times. But again, to your point, I think it's what you do now. And does that really, whenever you kind of made the transition, so you're in this group and then you get the anchor role for World News Sunday. And obviously I know you had, some pretty major coverage. Was 2005 a big, and I know you did a lot of Hurricane Katrina coverage. Was that a big exposure for you? Was that a big event for you?
I mean, so I got to ABC News the year 2000, and then about a year and a half after I arrived, 9/11 happened, and so that was a major turning point in my life, because then I became a combat reporter, which I never thought was going to happen. I did not come to ABC News thinking I was going to go be an international, I didn't think I was going to be working overseas at all, and I definitely didn't think I was going to be getting shot at.
Right.
And so I spent a lot of time getting shot at, and went to some really crazy places, and Iraq, Afghanistan, covered Israel, the West Bank, Gaza a lot as well. So that was a huge exposure. And then I came home from that and started covering presidential politics. I covered the John Kerry campaign. It didn't go well for John Kerry. Actually, it didn't go well for me either. Actually, I wasn't particularly good at that. And then in about 2005, I did get a big promotion, which was I started to anchor the Sunday edition of World News Tonight. So that was great. And so but it definitely put me on this track that I'm still on, frankly, of working all the time, not even getting weekends. And I think part of, I think one good thing that my early training gave me was I have a lot of energy. I mean, I can work hard. And even now that I have better work-life balance, I can still, even as I'm approaching 50, I can work pretty consistently at a reasonably high level for long periods of time. That is actually declining. I can feel it going down. But that's been a useful thing to have.
Sure.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it a few times. It's these experiences build that gear, that ability to do it, that mental fortitude. I call it the calluses from pull-ups.
Yes.
If you do enough pull-ups, everyone sucks at it. But once you know what that feels like, it's easier to continue to lean in. And in my, world of sales, it's when you put in the work and you have the tough conversations over and over and over again, it makes those, it makes it more, the repetition easier and the ability to lean into those sides of us easier. But you're right. I think, at least for me, I think I've also realized, and I'd be interested to hear your take in this too. I think you also realize sometimes you don't need it as much, that maybe you thought you needed it. You thought you needed it maybe more of like, I can't take a sick day. I can't do this. And then it's like, well, would things have been that different? So it's the opportunity cost that you never know.
I remember once I was back during my ill-fated turn as a political reporter. At one point I was covering, it was a night in 2004 during the Democratic primaries when Howard Dean tanked his, people may remember Howard Dean. He was, he was the star. He was the front runner in the Democratic primaries to take on George W. Bush in 2004. And after he lost Iowa, he got up and gave a speech and screamed at one point in a way that sounded really weird in the mic. And it tanked everything for him. Anyway, that night before the scream, I was doing a live shot. They made me do a live shot outside, even though it was like freezing rain out. And I got unbelievably sick, and so sick that I stayed in Des Moines for like a week after the whole circus moved on to New Hampshire. But I had to go to the hospital. I was really sick. And I came home and one of my bosses said, this thing of you getting sick is just a bad look. And that was typical ABC News at the time. So yeah, I mean, I think it is a very much a double-edged sword. I have a lot of energy and I can sustain attention and work for long periods of time. And I've learned, and this is backed up by the data, both anecdotal and I believe quantitative as well, that rest is part of work. that having, or it's also part of training. I was interviewing Chris Bosch, who's I don't know anything about sports, but Chris Bosch came on my podcast recently, and he's a big NBA player, and he was saying, rest is part of training. Recovery is part of physical training, and it is definitely, it's also true for, for what I do and for what you do, for what all of us do in our work lives. You need rest. And so I've gotten better at building rest into my days, meditation, exercise, lying down on the ground, petting the cats, playing with my son. I just stepped out of, before this interview with you, I stepped out of a meeting early because my son wanted to get in the pool. So I am much better at doing that now. But not, driving yourself too hard that's the other edge of the sword.
Yeah.
Is that you can degrade your ability to do good work. And I can make you a jerk.
Well, and I think it's a very personal choice based on a lot of different factors for people that, where and again, I'd be interested as we kind of like fast forward through your background here. So we'll jump back in, and then I've got maybe a couple questions around as we get into 10% happier and what that meant for you. So you're going through this again. You're getting these kind of consistent anchor roles. You then get the Good Morning America Weekend Edition 2010.
Yes,
roughly. Yeah.
Yes.
And again, like, is that at a point where, again, if it wasn't ABC News and you've had another anchor job, and there's some, obviously you've had continued success since then, is that a point where you kind of sit and say, okay, all right, I'm not at I'm still no Hotel Regina, right? But I'm going to at least rest and say, good job. Or I feel like I've accomplished something.
No.
Yeah.
I did not do that. I should have. If I could write a letter to my younger self, I would say do that. And I think there's the me in 2010, if I had a time machine and I could go back and argue with the me in 2010, I know that guy would say, you're talking about resting on your laurels.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's a difference between appreciation / gratitude and complacency. And that is a common misunderstanding. So you can be really excited about what you have. And I that's not to say I wasn't excited. I was very excited to get that job, but I definitely saw it as like a way station. I was shooting for much bigger things, and I continue to shoot for much bigger things, but I think have a better balance where I'm actually enjoying my life as I do it. And so I did not decide and sit and eat ice cream for the rest of my life after getting that job.
No, of course not.
I then a couple of years later got the job as the anchor of Nightline as well, and I was doing both gigs, and which was really hard on my body because I was staying up late to do Nightline a couple nights a week, and then getting up to do GMA on the weekends, and also traveling around the world to do stories. And it was during that period of time that 10%. Right around the time that I got the job at Weekend GMA, I was writing 10% Happier, and then I got the job at Nightline, and in 2014, for that whole period of time, that a whole 4 years, I was writing 10% Happier.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow.
Yes, it took about 5 years. And then I got the job at Nightline, and I was doing Nightline, Weekend GMA, and then 10% Happier came out. And it completely took over my life in ways that I did not expect. And so I was then in this period of just hyperdrive. I was such a hypocrite because I was Mr. Meditation guy.
That's what I was going to ask you. I've heard you talk about that before, about, that you put it out, it was there, and then you started to feel like a hypocrite because, when you look back, you're like, well, am I really doing all of that now? So yeah, I think that's a good kind of detail to share of talk about that. You have this success, the book takes off, number one, on the New York Times bestseller list. And then you have this feeling, what spurred that for you?
Well, the book was about meditation. And in one way, I was not a hypocrite in that I was meditating a lot. I actually set myself this unbelievable standard of trying to meditate 2 hours a day while doing everything else that you've just heard about. The one thing that made it a little easier was that I was my rule was I could do any increments, any amount at any time, and just add it up to 2 hours over the course of the day. But it was still insane. And I had a new baby at the time, and
right.
It was an insane period of time. And so the hypocrisy is not that I wasn't meditating; it was that I didn't have the balance. By the end of 10% Happier, the book, I had achieved some level of balance. But what I did not foresee was that 10% Happier, the book, was going to be so fucking successful that it would take over my life. And then I started a podcast. I started a venture-backed startup company, which has the meditation app. And I started giving speeches all over the place. I signed a deal to write 3 more books. I hosted a game show. Just the offers came in really fast. And I said yes to all of them because I wanted to live in the Hotel Regina. And even though I was a meditator, I was not, enlightened. And I hadn't conquered all of my demons. Good thing I called the book 10% Happier. So I mean,
you set the bar here.
Yeah, right? Meditation had really helped, and I did have something to offer, but I was not perfected, and success can be complicated. And so that was a pretty big learning experience.
And what's that journey? I mean, so as we talk about it, we'll put a link to the book in the show notes. And then obviously in 2017, have another book that comes out that, talks about some of these, additional details. What have you, so since the book, let's say over the last, 6-7 years, you started to talk a little bit about some of the balance. How have you found the balance now? How are you, and again, I know it's a struggle, I'm sure, every day or every new thing that comes, because as you continue to grow and you continue to, be more and more successful, never, ever quite getting to the Hotel Regina, but within arm's length. What would you say, again, as you're on this, and how are you either more appreciative, or how are you dealing with it or coping with it differently than, like, let's say that 2010 to 2014, 15 period? If you look at the last 5 to 6 years, like, what are some of the big takeaways and learnings that you've had, and ways that you've adjusted your way that you view, whether it's success or, some version of success or happiness?
A big turning point for me was, so I went into this really crazy period of time after 10% Happier came out, where I was kind of like a Pac-Man, just eating up all the pellets, while being pursued by ghosts. And then I had a 360 review. You know what that is?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So I suspect listeners to this podcast will know what that is, but
they do.
For the uninitiated, it's basically where you get people who work for you, with you, and above you to comment on how you're doing. And I did a 360 review in typical performative fashion that included people in my personal life. So it was like the colonoscopy version of a 360 review. My wife, my brother, a couple of meditation teachers. It was 17 people who participated. And it wasn't just like data entry. It was 17 hour-long anonymous phone calls with a company that was a Buddhist inflected coaching company that was doing the 360. And I got a 41-page report filled with blind quotes, and it was devastating. And there was some really good.
When was this? What year was this?
2018. So almost 3 years ago, almost exactly 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of positives. So the first 10 pages were very positive things. And then they talked about how I was pulled in too many directions. It was making me a jerk. I wasn't picking something and committing to it. And I was where I started to see how I was had a hierarchical attitude that was not good for junior employees. I could be overly dismissive in creative collaboration. So I saw some really hard things, and I've dedicated the last 3 years of my life to addressing those things. This is my next book, actually, is about this. And I think one of the things that wasn't in the 360, but has been the principal thing I've worked on. Well, one of the principal things I've worked on is actually changing my inner talk. Now, I had done a lot of work on this in meditation, but not enough. And I actually believe that meditation isn't the only modality. I mean, I've always been pro therapy, but I've done quite a bit of therapy and executive coaching, and I have communications coaches, and I have a podcast, which is basically like me getting free therapy a couple times a week because I'm talking to these gurus who, I'm getting all this interesting feedback. And self-compassion, that's again a term of art. It sounds vaguely masturbatory, but it is the idea that it is different from self-esteem or having a big ego. And even Aristotle had like two different words. There's self-love that is kind of just like narcissistic, and then there's also self-love that just is like, oh yeah, I too am worthy of being coached well. I don't need to talk to myself like an inner drill sergeant. I can talk to myself like a coach who's tough and sees where I need to do work, but also is supportive. And that changing my inner weather in that way has spilled out into how I treat other people, and that has been a big unlock for me in terms of improving my relationships. And in terms of the balance that you asked me about, it is still a work in progress. I still work too much, but I work less than I used to, and I work differently. There is much more sanity in terms of the timelines I set for myself. There's much more sanity in terms of how I talk to myself as I'm doing the work. I've been working on this book, which is a proper sequel to 10% Happier, which is going to talk about the 360 and its aftermath. And it's very hard. It's embarrassing. It's personal. And sometimes I'll just get up and lie down on the floor. And that's okay. I don't try to work through the pain all the time. Yeah.
Do you feel, was there for people listening, maybe, as we're, coming to an end now, was there a takeaway? And again, obviously kind of a precursor to the book, or maybe as you're thinking about kind of the functional ways to kind of do some of this, were there a few, maybe one or two very actionable takeaways around shaping that inner voice and narrative?
Yes. We've talked about, we talked about meditation generically, but anybody who's heard of meditation, the odds are that you've heard about a meditation called mindfulness, which is where you sort of sit and feel your breath coming in and going out. And then every time you get distracted, you start again. That's like basic beginning mindfulness. Feel your breath. Then you'll notice you get distracted a million times. That's cool. You just notice the distraction, start again and again and again. And this is the kind of meditations that's been studied the most in the labs. It's been shown to change the brain and the rest of our physiology in lots of salutary ways. There is another kind of meditation that is often taught alongside it, but hasn't gotten as much airtime. And it's in part because to some of us, some people love this, but I didn't love this. It can come off as cheesy because it's called loving kindness meditation.
Sure.
And you sit and picture people and say kind things like, may you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be free from suffering, et cetera, et cetera. I've described it as like Valentine's Day with a gun to your head.
Yeah.
And however, the data on this kind of meditation are really, really compelling about this physiological, psychological, and behavioral impact this kind of practice can have, the kind of impact it can have on you. And, it's not only you're directing it outward, but you're directing it at yourself. And for me, it was like, trying to pour water on top of a sheet of metal. It just didn't get through for years, but I've done a lot of it now, and it starts to change you. And for me, that's the way it's worked. And it's changed my inner weather in ways that, like, I'm less brutal on myself. I'm much more inclined toward generosity and being less judgmental toward other people. And because it leads to a positive upward spiral, which is because relationships are probably the most important factor in human happiness. My inner weather improving my relationships leads to my inner weather getting even better, and then my relationships get even better, and up we go in a positive self-reinforcing spiral. So that's really important. So that gets to two of the really practical takeaways I would recommend. One is loving kindness meditation. Even if you think it's sappy, the data are incredibly strong. Go for it. The other thing is be aware. And if there's one thing the pandemic should have taught us, is the primacy of human interaction. Social interaction is probably the most important variable in human flourishing. And so paying attention, nobody teaches us how to do relationships, intimate or professional or friend relationships. The basic unit of human happiness is so overlooked in our education. So getting into these so-called soft skills, how to do communication, how to, couples counseling is something that I started to do over the last couple of years. Getting systematic about making sure your relationships are good is something that I highly, highly recommend.
I think these are very practical takeaways for all of you listening, and just thinking about what are the things that you can do. And I think we've talked about this a few times too, Dan, as we come to an end here, that it doesn't mean you lose your edge. There's such a stigma that's attached with the combination of this idea of aggression, hard forging, and being able to take these moments to be there for yourself, and that the two are incapable of having a place, or at least maybe changing the way that you viewed it before. Because I don't think you describe it, and I don't think anybody listening would think that you've taken your foot off the gas. No. And I think that's such an important message. And so as we wrap up, Dan, I want to say a big thank you. If you haven't read Dan's book, 10% Happier, I really highly recommend it. And it was a book that I was very glad that I found. It really helped me to, process different ways for me to be able to take a little bit of time. And I'm really looking forward to the next book as well. And so I want to thank you, Dan, for the book. I'm looking forward to the next one. And thank you again so much for joining me on the Jake Dunlap Show.
Thanks, Jake.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We will see you on the next episode.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in to another extremely fun and interesting episode. I thought it was fun and interesting, so I hope you did too, of the Jake Dunlap Show. Really great, just breaking down everything that makes people who they are, the success, the trials and errors, and I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. Make sure to subscribe on your favorite platform, and make sure, more than anything, to go over to jakedunlap.com. That's where you're going to stay up to date on all the latest guests, additional details, prep notes. We're going to be sharing everything on jakedunlap.com. So go ahead, go over there. You can subscribe there as well too, and we will see you next week on the Jake Dunlap Show.